When a child enters a relationship with a narcissistic partner, something subtle but deeply significant often begins to unfold. The child, who should naturally exist as a symbol of love, growth, and shared responsibility, can slowly become something else entirely within the psychological structure of the relationship. In a healthy family dynamic, a child strengthens the bond between parents, encouraging cooperation and mutual care. But within a narcissistic dynamic, the child may become a tool in an invisible struggle for power. A narcissistic personality tends to view relationships through the lens of control and validation, rather than genuine connection. Because of this, the child may unconsciously be placed into the middle of the emotional battlefield. Decisions about the child, education, discipline, affection, even simple daily routines, can become opportunities to assert dominance. What appears on the surface as ordinary parenting disagreements may actually conceal a deeper psychological contest. You may notice moments where the child is used to provoke guilt, to challenge your authority, or to create emotional pressure. Access to the child's affection can subtly become conditional. Praise might be distributed in ways that elevate one parent while quietly diminishing the other. The child may hear statements designed to shape their perception of you, not necessarily through obvious accusations, but through small, repeated suggestions that slowly influence how they see their father. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the child rarely understands what is happening. From their perspective, they are simply responding to the emotional signals given by the parent who appears most dominant in the environment. Over time, this dynamic can distort the natural relationship between father and child, creating distance where there should be trust and warmth. And this is where the psychological challenge truly begins for the father. He must learn to recognize that the struggle is not merely about disagreements over parenting. It is about understanding how power, ego, and emotional manipulation can quietly reshape a family system. The moment you see this clearly is the moment everything begins to change. Because a child should never be a weapon in a war that was never theirs to fight. Another subtle transformation often occurs once a child enters this dynamic, and it unfolds so gradually that many fathers fail to recognize it until the damage has already taken root. The authority of the father, which should naturally develop through presence, consistency, and guidance, begins to erode. Not through open confrontation alone, but through a series of quiet, repeated gestures that slowly reshape how the child perceives him. In a balanced family structure, both parents reinforce each other's role. Even when disagreements exist, they are handled privately, so the child continues to see both parents as stable figures of guidance. But within a narcissistic dynamic, the opposite frequently occurs. The father's words may be contradicted in front of the child. His decisions may be subtly dismissed. A rule he sets might be immediately softened, questioned, or openly reversed. At first, these moments appear trivial. A small comment here, a light joke there. Perhaps a remark that frames the father as overly strict, overly sensitive, or simply incapable of understanding the child. Each instance seems insignificant on its own. But psychologically, repetition carries enormous power. Over time, the child begins to internalize a message. The father's authority is negotiable, uncertain, or less important. And the child, being naturally adaptive, begins to respond accordingly. They may start turning to the narcissistic parent for final decisions, even when the father has already spoken. They may test boundaries more frequently with him, sensing that his position in the family hierarchy is no longer firmly supported. For the father, this creates a deeply confusing experience. He may feel himself becoming increasingly frustrated, raising his voice more often, trying harder to be heard. Yet each attempt to reclaim authority can paradoxically reinforce the image that has already been planted, that he is the unstable or unreasonable one. What is truly happening is not merely a disagreement about parenting. It is a gradual psychological reframing of identity within the family system. And if a father does not recognize this process early, he may one day realize that his authority was never lost in a single moment. It was quietly dismantled piece by piece while he believed everything was still normal. Because respect within a family rarely disappears suddenly, it erodes silently wherever it is no longer protected. Another consequence that often emerges in this kind of environment is that the child is gradually pulled into emotional roles that no child should ever have to carry. Instead of being allowed to develop freely, the child becomes an intermediary in the emotional tensions between the parents. This rarely happens through explicit instructions. More often, it unfolds through subtle psychological pressures that the child slowly learns to respond to. A narcissistic personality frequently seeks validation and emotional reinforcement from the people closest to them. When a child is present, that child can become a convenient source of this validation. The parent may share frustrations about the father, not always directly accusing him, but hinting, sighing, or speaking in ways that quietly invite the child's sympathy. The child may hear phrases that suggest disappointment, sacrifice, or emotional suffering, all framed in a way that encourages the child to feel responsible for easing that tension. At first, the child may simply listen, but over time, they begin to sense that certain responses bring approval while others create discomfort. They may learn that agreeing with one parent earns warmth, while defending the other brings tension. In this way, the child becomes emotionally conditioned to lean toward whichever position maintains peace in the moment. The psychological cost of this dynamic is profound. A child naturally desires connection with both parents. Being placed between them creates an internal conflict that the developing mind is not equipped to resolve. Loyalty becomes divided. Love begins to feel conditional. Instead of experiencing family as a place of stability, the child begins navigating an invisible emotional landscape, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid upsetting one side or the other. For the father, this situation can feel particularly painful. He may notice his child repeating opinions that do not seem entirely their own, or expressing distance that was never present before. Yet confronting the issue directly can sometimes intensify the conflict, making the situation even more delicate. What must be understood is that this is not simply a matter of family disagreement. It is the quiet transformation of a child into an emotional mediator, and a child who is forced to carry the emotional weight of adult conflicts is learning a lesson far too early, that love, in their world, comes with sides to choose.
When a child enters a relationship already shaped by narcissistic dynamics, the psychological landscape for the father becomes far more complicated. What may once have been a difficult marriage now transforms into something deeper, a form of emotional bondage that is far harder to escape. The presence of the child changes the entire calculation. Before children, a man who senses manipulation or constant psychological conflict may still imagine the possibility of leaving. The decision is painful, but it remains conceivable. Once a child is involved, however, the emotional stakes multiply. The father is no longer thinking only about his own well-being. Every decision now passes through a far more powerful question. What will happen to my child if I step away? This is precisely where the dynamic can tighten its grip. A narcissistic personality often understands, consciously or unconsciously, that the father's deepest vulnerability is his love for his child. That love becomes the invisible chain that keeps him tied to situations he might otherwise refuse to tolerate. Criticism, emotional manipulation, and constant tension may continue, yet the father endures it because the alternative feels even more frightening, in the idea of losing daily presence in his child. Life, over time, this can create a profound inner conflict. On one side is the instinct for self-respect and psychological health. On the other side is the instinct to protect and remain close to one's child. The father may begin sacrificing more and more of himself in an effort to preserve stability for the child, hoping that patience will eventually restore harmony. But the deeper psychological reality is that enduring dysfunction indefinitely does not necessarily protect a child. Children are remarkably perceptive. They absorb the emotional atmosphere of their environment, even when the conflict is hidden beneath polite surfaces. The father eventually faces a painful realization. Remaining silent does not always preserve peace. Sometimes it simply preserves the system that created the suffering. And the crucial question becomes not merely how long one can endure, but whether endurance without awareness quietly teaches the next generation to do the same. One of the most overlooked consequences of this environment is not what happens between the parents, but what quietly takes root within the mind of the child. Children learn far less from what we tell them, and far more from what they repeatedly observe. The home becomes their first model of how relationships function, how love is expressed, and how power operates between two people. When a child grows up in a household shaped by narcissistic patterns, they are exposed to a relational blueprint that can subtly distort their understanding of connection. They may witness manipulation disguised as care, control presented as protection, or criticism framed as concern. Because the child has no other reference point, these patterns begin to feel normal. The psychological atmosphere becomes the standard by which they interpret relationships in the future. A child in this environment may also learn something even more complex, that love is unstable and must be carefully managed. They may notice that approval is given when certain behaviors or opinions align with one parent's expectations. Disagreement may bring tension, distance, or emotional withdrawal. Gradually, the child adapts by becoming highly sensitive to emotional shifts, learning to anticipate reactions and adjust their behavior to maintain peace. While this adaptability may help them survive the immediate environment, it can carry long-term consequences. As adults, they may struggle to distinguish between healthy influence and manipulation. They may tolerate controlling partners, believing that emotional volatility is simply part of intimacy. In some cases, they may unconsciously repeat the very behaviors they once witnessed, continuing the pattern rather than breaking it. This is why the father's awareness becomes so crucial. His presence, his responses, and his emotional stability can offer the child an alternative model of strength and integrity. Even in difficult circumstances, the way he carries himself can demonstrate that dignity, patience, and honesty still exist within the family structure. A child does not need perfection from a parent. What they need is a living example of balance and truth. Because the patterns a child sees today are often the relationships they will unconsciously recreate tomorrow. Eventually, every father who finds himself in such a dynamic arrives at a deeply personal crossroads. It is not a moment that announces itself loudly. More often, it emerges quietly through a growing awareness that something within the family system is not only unhealthy, but unsustainable. The patterns we have been discussing, the manipulation, the erosion of authority, the emotional burden placed upon the child, begin to form a larger picture that can no longer be ignored. At this stage, many fathers face a difficult internal dilemma. One path is silence. Silence feels safer in the short term. It avoids conflict, reduces immediate tension, and preserves the appearance of stability within the household. For a man who wishes to protect his child from chaos, silence can seem like the responsible choice. But there is another path, and it requires far more courage. It begins with awareness. A father must first see the dynamic clearly, without minimizing it, and without allowing guilt or confusion to distort his perception. Psychological clarity becomes essential. Once a man understands the structure of the situation, he can begin establishing boundaries not through anger or domination, but through calm, consistent strength. This does not mean engaging in endless arguments or attempting to control the narcissistic partner. Such efforts rarely succeed. Instead, it means strengthening one's own character and presence within the child's life. The father becomes a steady psychological anchor. His words align with his actions. His boundaries remain firm yet composed. Over time, the child begins to sense the difference between emotional chaos and grounded stability. What the father ultimately demonstrates is something far more powerful than authority alone. He models self-respect, emotional maturity, and the courage to stand in truth even when circumstances are difficult. These qualities shape the child's understanding of strength far more profoundly than any lecture ever could. In the end, the real question is not whether the situation is difficult. It almost certainly is. The question is whether the father will allow the environment to define him, or whether he will consciously define the example his child grows up watching. Because the greatest lesson a father can give his child is not control over others, but mastery over himself.